Alright, this video is going to cover programs, errors, and debugging. So this is chapters 1.3 through 1.8 in the Talking Through Code textbook. So before we start, let's open PyCharm. And because we have used this Talking Through Code chapter 2 before, it's going to show up as a recently used project in PyCharm, so I can just click on it. And now that we're here, I want to create a new Python file, programs, errors, and debugging. So that's going to be our pattern throughout this whole thing. We're going to open PyCharm, making sure it's the right project, and then immediately create our Python file that we're going to use for the video. So now that I have this Python file open, I'm going to go ahead and close out the left pane so I have only code on the screen. Alright, so some of this video is just content, so we're going to have to go over that. So we've got, what is a program really? So it's a specific way to perform an operation. So it's the way that we do things. And for us, a program is going to be a Python program, right? It's the instructions we use to tell the computer what to do. So it's more instructions. So we're about to write a Python program here. So whenever we are writing programs, it's inevitable that we're going to make mistakes, right? We're going to make lots of different kinds of mistakes. But this is what we're going to be talking about throughout the whole thing, right? What are those types of errors, and how would you go about figuring out how to fix them? So there's a joke, but it's kind of true, right? Being a detective and a murder mystery in which you are also the murderer. Figuring out bugs. Alright, so whenever we're talking about debugging, we are trying to figure out what we did wrong in our own code, right? So we did something wrong, and now we're trying to figure it out. And that's hard to do if you're going to use the same thought process to try to figure out the bug that you used to get into the bug, right? It's following the same path through the woods that led you to a dead end. So you have to use some techniques to sort of jumpstart the process of figuring out what you did wrong so you don't get stuck in this loop. All right, so let's get our main set up. And I know that we haven't gone over pretty much any of this so far, right? But we need a longer program to be able to look at the 3 types of errors that we care about. So let's look at those types of errors. So types of errors. So the first one, this is a syntax error. So this is a structure problem. This is when your code will not run because you did something so basically wrong, the interpreter doesn't know how to handle it. So that's a syntax error. And let's look at an example of that. So we're going to attempt to write a program that will determine if a user given number is even or odd. So is a user number even or odd? All right, so again, we haven't gone over most of this, but we're about to get input from the user. So the way this would work is we'd have a variable number. It's equal to int input, enter a number, an integer. This works, right? It is structurally correct. For this statement on line 13, the parentheses have to match. So every open parentheses has to have a closing parentheses in the correct order. If I remove the last closed parentheses, which we know has to be there, I'll get a syntax error. And in PyCharm, syntax errors are shown with that red squiggly line, and then if I hover over them, it'll tell me what I did wrong. So it's either a comma or a parentheses is expected. So this one is pretty helpful, and sometimes the syntax errors are not especially helpful, right? So you have to be able to know what could be wrong with the code you just wrote, right? They're not always as straightforward as the one we just saw. For instance, functions in Python have to have content inside of them. If they don't, it's a syntax error. So here's where the syntax error is showing up. And if I hover over the error, come on, give me the error. I don't care so much about what an if statement is. So let's see here. So the error that it would be giving me if it would, let's get rid of the if statement so that it's not there. The error is expected indent for this part, right? So that doesn't really tell me what's going wrong, right? If you know more about how code works, you can figure it out. But it doesn't say that the main function is empty, which is the actual problem. So let's put our code back so we get rid of that syntax error. All right, so that was a syntax error, right? Doing something structurally wrong. So syntax error if missing ending parenthesis. So the next type of error is a runtime error. Happens as program runs. So in this setup, we're going to get input from the user, and things can go wrong there based on user input. That's not quite a syntax error. Quite a runtime error. A runtime error might be something like this. So here, I'm attempting to create an integer based off of a string, right? That's what the int function does. It takes a string and converts it to an integer. But 4.5 is not an integer. So when I run this, I get this runtime error, invalid literal for int with base 10 4.5. So that's not a syntax error because the computer's not smart enough to realize that 4.5 as a string is not going to become a valid integer. So no syntax error there, it's structurally correct. But at runtime, something went wrong because 4.5 creates our runtime error since 4.5 is not an integer. All right, so we're going to put this back so we don't have the syntax error for the main. And we're going to keep going trying to figure out if the number is even or odd, which is going to lead to the third type of error, which is semantic. Doesn't do what it's supposed to. So this one, the code, it interprets correctly, it doesn't have a runtime error, but it just doesn't do what you want it to do, which we'll see here. So I'm going to do an if-else statement, which we also haven't learned yet, that's going to say if the number mod 2 is 1, print even, else print odd. All right, so this code is wrong. A number mod 2 being 1 means that it's odd. So this is going to be exactly wrong. We can see that when we run it. So the things to do whenever you're running a piece of code is to test it, right? We want to be giving it values that will actually test it to make sure that it's working. So you have to know what the goal of your program is in order to know if it's working or not. So we're going to do a 4. 4 is not odd, but let's see what happens when we enter an odd number. 7. Says that it's even, which is wrong, right? This is exactly opposite. So this is a semantic error. Rewrote code, again, that is structurally correct, does not cause a runtime error immediately, but is wrong. So we have to switch this from a 1 to a 0. So if check equal to 1, the semantic error. Incorrect. Good. So now we run this and we do a 4. it says that 4 is even, which is correct. And if we do a 7, it says the 7 is odd, which is also correct. So if we were doing a much more complicated program, we might consider doing some experimental debugging, right? And this is sort of the first way that people learn to debug, which we'll sort of fix later when we talk about the debugger in a later chapter. But experimental debugging is essentially putting if statements into your code to figure out, putting print statements into your code, potentially inside of an if statement, to figure out the flow of execution of your program, making sure things are being hit, what is the value of this variable at this line, that sort of thing. It is not the best way. It is not the best way to debug, right? It's error prone. If you put your print statement in the wrong place, it may do things that you're not expecting. So you do want to be using the debugger most of the time, which we'll learn about in a later video. But as you're beginning your programming, it's okay to just put some debugging print statements in, realizing that that is not the end goal for how you're going to be doing debugging. All right, so that's it, right? We talked about a program, debugging, and then the types of errors and how to recognize them. All right, so the next video is going to be about the development process, and then we're going to rewrite our Hello World program from the previous videos. These are chapters 1.9 through 1.13.